And what does that mean for the next generation people who are just trying to live their lives in the best ways that we can, um, without it being diluted to a proxy war between the democratic machine, again, which has its issues, but also throughout history has, served its role in representation and getting more black and brown folks into the political pipeline. Black and brown folks who have never left the pipeline and have been in that pipeline for 50, 60 years and don't know how to step down, which has led to this movement of reformers, of progressives, of leftists, of the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America, who have seen a Democratic Party who has failed for a variety of reasons, but still failed time and time again. And so I don't necessarily think it's about ideology, or if it's DSA versus Democrats, or this is really about Daria Zila versus Esquiat. I think this is really a coming to not just New York, but America, of how can we each build a life where we can live a life that's comfortable, where we're not struggling to pay rent, where we don't have to work 3 jobs just to pay the bill, where our kids can play and go to school in neighborhoods that aren't next to brownfields, right? Just basic things that are still issues because the party apparatus for...
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Tradeoff. I'm your host, Rosalind Smith. Every election season, we're reminded to vote. We hear about turnout, polls, campaigns, candidates. But what happens after Election Day? How do communities build influence, hold leaders accountable, and turn civic participation into lasting power? Today's guest has spent much of her career helping people answer those very questions. Joining me today is Na'ilah Amaru, a leader whose work spans military service, grassroots organizing, public policy, coalition building, and civic engagement. Throughout her career, she has focused on helping communities move beyond moments of political participation towards sustained involvement in the decisions that shape their lives. And with New York's primary election approaching, and voting rights, democracy reform, and community accountability continuing to dominate national conversations, I couldn't think of a better person to help us unpack what meaningful civic engagement actually looks like. Today, we'll talk about the difference between voting and governing power, what communities should be paying attention to heading into the primary, and how coalitions create change, and what everyday people can do to make an impact long after campaign signs come down. So, Na'ilah, thank you so much for being here today. And wait a minute, where are you repping? Because I'm in the Bronx. Where are you?
I am repping the village of Harlem. Always, although I do hail from my beloved city, the city of Atlanta. I've been a proud New Yorker for the past 16 years, and proud to have called Harlem home since my first day as a New Yorker.
Well, I love that, and I feel like after 16 years, you've definitely earned your stripes. I feel like anywhere you sow, and when I think of all the work that you have like sown into community, then that's where home is for you.
I see that. New York is a state of mind. So I feel like I was a New Yorker my first day because just the energy of the people and the community, I knew that I was home my first day as a New Yorker. So I think that New York is a state of mind. But yes, once I managed to figure out, I think the bus routes and the MTA systems, and I knew like the tricks of when to, how to navigate on the weekends, I feel that was my own personal metric test of when I could call myself a New Yorker.
I think New York has helped me get my steps in. And sometimes
yes.
I get cautious, like, oh my goodness, if I ever leave, will I walk as much?
Yeah, no.
Probably not. But okay. So let's start with help people understand something. What is the difference between, okay, I'm voting, and governing power? Because I think we're beating the drum about, hey, everyone has to vote. And so I feel that the time that we're in, everything that has occurred with the current administration, and even some of the things that we are facing locally, people know that they have to vote, right? But we want more than that. We want people to be informed about how this actually works.
Absolutely. So I think a few things. One, that question ties into 2 points I think are really important to make clear to folks, no matter where they are in their advocacy or civic engagement journey. Is one, understanding the gap that exists between voting and showing up on election day, and what sustained civic engagement actually is. And then how sustained civic engagement, leads to how people understand what actual influence is, which is the part of governing power that we're trying to build. So first and foremost, voting is incredibly important, but voting is the floor, right? It's the minimum entry point and not the finish line. And I think sometimes we're taught to go vote, go vote, go vote. And then once we pull the lever, we cast our ballots or we slip the paper ballots into the machine, that we've done our duty. And to a large degree, yes, we have. But also to the point that you raised, what does accountability look like beyond showing up on a random Tuesday in November? We're now here in New York. We have early voting where you can, show up and vote at a designated early polling site up to 7 days before actually election day. To be clear, the world of politics does not stop or begin on election night, right? There are decisions that are made in budget hearings, which decide which agencies get much money, who is the beneficiary of those funding allocations. There are legislative conversations that are happening in legislative committee rooms at your local municipality or at the state, right? That you may or may not be able to see on TV. And so the through line is that the communities that show up on election night have influence, but only on election night, right? Through an electoral lens. But the communities that stay engaged in the off years and after election night, those are the communities that build power, right? And that's what leads us to this reality that there's an entire infrastructure of how political decisions are made that happen not on election night, but between elections. And that's the gap that most people don't really understand exists. And that's intentional by design. And so I want to move very quickly into unpacking, how do we build political influence? Like, what is it and how do we build it? Most people think that influence politically is about access, when I would argue, based off of my experiences across the spectrum, that it's really about leverage, right? Who can mobilize people, who can deliver what people are asking for, and who has the power and the capacity to apply that political pressure, right? They're not disconnected. They're very much integrated to one another. And so a really important part of that is understanding the relationships that we have as constituents with our elected officials does matter. However, those relationships without accountability are really just a fancy way of saying that you have, a network. And so the governing power that comes through influence isn't built, again, just on election night. It's built in the off season, right? When there isn't an election. It's when you're doing the work of showing up and continuing to have conversations with the decision makers that help shape what's possible in terms of funding that comes to your communities, in terms of legislation that impacts, your community, however you choose to define it, for better or for worse. And so this is really where I want to lean into this concept and practice of accountability in the reality that elections matter, voting matters, 110%. But if you show up and turn out, if you live in a neighborhood that has a high turnout, but that high turnout without any follow-up conversations with the elected officials, then it's just a blank check. You've given political power to someone with no strings attached, right? And so then accountability becomes our responsibility as private citizens, as community residents, in terms of what are the people that you gave the power to really talking about? Well, you don't know unless you're in conversation with them, right? And so one of the things I've learned from my experiences as executive director of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus is that role is primarily about aligning budget and legislative priorities for council members that represent their respective districts, right? But who I'm in conversation with are the people who show up and are really pushing towards accountability for me and I, as well as the caucus members. And so I think what I want to land the plane with to this first question, I think, is understanding the different parts of government and our role as not just as citizens, but as residents, right? In terms of showing up and voting as a bare minimum, but really leading into our responsibility and educating ourselves on the issues that most impact us, our communities, and our families, and figuring out who are those people that we need to get in front of and just have, and not just have conversations, but steer conversations and lead those conversations to make sure that they know that when we show up on election night, that we're not just handing away our power, but that we are trusting them with this tool of accountability that is us. We are the accountability. We are the tool to building empowerment. And it is our civic engagement sustained over time after election day, which is what gives us the opportunity to build real governing power as private citizens in trying to build a government that really does reflect, of, by, and for the people.
And so I love everything that you said. And first of all, you sandwiched a whole lot in there. This is a double, triple whopper. I need to cut this with extra cheese, okay? I gotta cut through. And because here's the thing, I think a lot of what you said, right? We hear that. And for me, as someone who has worked on the consultancy side of it and the tactical side of it, what my observation is, I don't think people understand the mechanics, that there's literally somebody who is being paid money to look at the data.
Yep.
And look at who came to the polls and look at their demographics, right? To put that into calculation on how they're going to move, or whether or not they feel there will be consequences for how they show up in the office that they've been elected to. And then furthermore, even when we think about the process of re-election or someone running for higher office or just the entire political ecosystem, even when we consider the media buying space and the trickle-down effect, right? I feel as though when it comes to people of color, so whether that's Black, Asian, Latin, or whatever is grouped under that, right? If they see, statistically speaking, that there are a lot of numbers behind a specific group, that is how they even make decisions about where ad dollars are spent. Absolutely. In terms of courting your next vote. And they pay people literally to come up with messaging to resonate with the groups that turn out. So I think, to your point, yeah, we can't be writing a blank check. And it has to be very clear that our votes are worth being courted, and there will be a consequence if you do not do the things that you said you were going to do. Now, I'm curious, and everything that you said, how did you come to that awareness? And I know that part of your journey includes service. And I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you. You said a whole lot. One thing I want to double down on and uplift what you said is the reality that election turnout is a game of mathematics of who shows up, right? And so if you don't show up electorally, you are not part of the political calculation that a lot of elected officials make political decisions off of. One of the lessons I've learned is that press, money, and votes are the three prongs of political decision making. And if you don't come from a lot of money, if you don't represent a constituency, or you personally can't cut the big checks, or if you're not in the media aspect of issue framing and storytelling and the PR lens, your power is really the vote, right? And so there's a lot to unpack in what you just brought up, because as someone who has worked a lot of political electoral campaigns, there is a strategy that every campaign has to make a decision on in terms of, do we lock in on our triple prime voters? And those are the folks who may be listening and may not be familiar with the codes of 3, 2s, and 1s. It's essentially meaning an electoral campaign has limited time and limited resources. And we have to make a decision in terms of what is the best return on investment on where we are spending our money and who we are spending our money on to convince to build support for our candidate. If you're in the voter universe and you have shown yourself as someone who consistently comes out to the polls, you are our number one target in terms of who we want to get in front of. However, if you are not part of our electoral universe because you haven't voted or you vote inconsistently, then we don't see you as an investment in terms of a voter that would be a solid return on investment. And that's the other reality in terms of kind of thinking through strategically, which voters do we want to prioritize and which people in the neighborhood do we not necessarily feel would be the best return on investment. Some campaigns will lean in on a triple prime, and other campaigns, there are, a lot of insurgent grassroots led campaigns that will build a bigger base and be like, okay, you haven't voted in an election in the last 2 or 3 cycles. We're going to pay canvassers, or we're going to have volunteers come out and knock on your door to bring you back into the electoral space, right? And so one of the things that I think is really important for your listeners to understand is that, yes, voting is the floor, but voting is a very important in the sense of, are you even going to put yourself on the scoreboard? And the way that you do that is by voting, so that you do become part of a political calculation when it comes to the incumbent. The other thing I wanted to uplift to that, going, and I think tying back into, my own journey of, how did I come to see the board for what it is I did start off in the military. I joined the Army 3 days after high school. I was an ammunition specialist. I learned a lot about life, leadership, myself, going through that experience. And when I came out of the service, I served time in Iraq. I was a 55 robber ammunition specialist. And I found that a lot of the skills that I learned in the military, ironically, or perhaps not ironically, have trained me very well to navigate advocacy, policy, and politics. My first job out of the military was essentially being a tenant organizer, organizing tenants for housing justice. And that experience showed me that I should always challenge myself to think about the concept of impact. And while I loved my work as an organizer, I absolutely adored bringing people on this journey, knocking on someone's door and changing their mind frame from government is this abstract big black box, something that happens to me, into walking with them on this journey and unpacking that abstract institution and showing people that government is made of people, and those people make up institutions, and those people make up processes, and those people make up systems that can change. But they can change only if you, as a private citizen or resident of this community, are willing to engage in some way to help change the process, in order to help change the system, in order to help change the institution, or quite frankly, the people who are running the institution. But I also learned that as much as I enjoyed the direct one-on-one political education, as an organizer, my impact was somewhat limited in terms of scale. And again, there's no right or wrong or more or less important. It's just, scale and impact, ebb and flow, and depending on where you want to sit in any particular, I think, chapter of life. I wanted to move beyond the individual growth of I'm impacting and teaching people the one-on-ones of civic engagement and political empowerment. And I realized I'm good at what I do in the sense that I can organize a rally, but if I don't have access to the decision makers who are making those policy decisions, who are making those budget decisions that give me the reason to have to organize people in the first place, then that's a space that I really want to lean into. And so I moved into city government for a while because I felt like that was the institution that I, would be in a literal role where I could make decisions on where government investments could go. And then I learned very quickly there is a politics to the budget process, right? So money isn't just doled out based off of which community organization has the most trusters making the most impact, right? Oftentimes political decisions are what drives the politics of the budget. And that was a really hard lesson for me to learn when I was starry-eyed and bushy-tailed and just wanted to, use my platform to build. And then I realized in order for me to build the way that I want, with who I want, in the way that I know is needed, then government definitely has its limitations. And so I have navigated back and forth over the last 20 years, moving between electoral campaigns, issue campaigns. I've been lobbyist for nonprofit organizations. I have been a government staffer. I worked on Capitol Hill for quite some time. I moved out to New York and fell in love with the city and have been here since, building a life really rooted in city and state processes, really trying to think through knowing what I know from my variety of experiences, having served my community as a grassroots organizer, literally on the ground, knocking on doors, to the highest echelons of government as a Capitol Hill staffer, and every role in between has really shown me the board of where power lies and where it doesn't. And most importantly, especially for communities of color, for working class, immigrant communities, for the groups of people that come from identities that don't traditionally have the traditional access to power, my greatest joy is challenging people to rethink how they understand political power. And while there are formal systems and formal processes and abstract institutions that by design are made difficult to navigate, my joy in the work that I do across the different roles that I've had has been able to demystify and break down these processes, break down these institutions, and show them for what they are, things that can be changed, but they can only be changed when we as a people show up and force them to change. And that begins again with political education. It begins with thinking through, maybe I don't have the traditional access to power because I don't come from a certain zip code or I don't come from a certain background. But we as a people have always been very, quite frankly, geniuses at, making a way out of no way, right? Of like, let's look at who we have within our communities. Let's look at the talent and skills that we have on the block. And let's figure out how we can create coalitions or organizations or volunteer-led campaign to challenge the status quo. And to me, again, these are lessons I've learned about power and unpacking my own understanding of power, which has changed and evolved over time, right? As an organizer, political power to me was being able to organize a press rally and put out a negative press hit against an elected official that wasn't doing right. When I moved into a government agency, political power to me was conceptually, being able to be in a position where I could intentionally invest government resources into community-based organizations that would then have the resources they need to expand and deepen their impact. When I was the Capitol Hill staffer, political power was being able to build a coalition of, of colleagues and using information as needed, from a staffer lens. When I was executive director of the Black Latino Asian Caucus here in New York, power to me was again finding and building bridges between the needs of a community-based organization with the priorities of the caucus, right? And so power as we understand it can change and evolve over time depending on the space that we're in. But fundamentally, it's about understanding first and foremost that we have it. And too often we realize we don't think that we have it, or we give it away too quickly. And so just to land this plane, again, identifying those opportunities for us as communities that do not have that traditional access to power is that when we come together and we choose to redefine power together, when we build it together, collectively is when we do have that ability to build governing influence and finally be able to be in spaces and the rooms and positions where we can have the investments and resources that our communities need when we act together collectively.
Yes, as you were speaking, I was visualizing the various spaces that you have been in, and concurrently, I thought about my own journey and experience is that, yes, we talk about community and collective power and accountability and responsibility. And I think there are many in the space that want to do good. However, and I don't know if this is true for you, but as I've navigated different roles, whether that was private sector, public sector, electoral, consulting spaces, right? There are people and groups and cliques that are more committed maybe to the status quo than they are to the actual task at hand. And that has frustrated me. And as I was listening to you and some of the things you were saying that you've done, I know that even in spaces where we think that we're all on the same team and want the same thing, if you're actually about the work, there's a level of dislike and issues that come up in the process of getting the work done. So there's macro political, but then it's once I'm in this position and I think that I'm excited and I can do so much, it's looking at, well, where am I as an individual on the chessboard in the whatever ecosystem that I'm in, and how effective am I going to be with some of these players that they talk a really good game, but when it comes time to execute and deliver for the community, they behave in ways that seem contradictory to what they, espouse. So How have you navigated through those situations? And for us as a community, like, okay, there's voting, right? And there's elected offices, and then there's appointed offices, and then there are task force and all these other things. So for the community, how do we hold the system accountable? Or what is it going to take to get some of these rotten apples? Like, how do we just get them out the way so the people who actually want to do the good work can do their work?
That's a word, because you ain't told one lie. One of the most frustrating aspects of my work in advocacy is, and it's not just nonprofits, although nonprofits I would say are a perfect example of nonprofits that were created to solve a problem, become the problem itself, right? And then when there's an opportunity to push, leadership of said nonprofits don't want to push because they don't want to lose their invitations to the holiday party at the Gracie Mansions, or they don't want to lose access to whomever is in the executive chambers. And so it's an unfortunate reality that you have a lot of community-based organizations, more so on the nonprofit side, that have the C3 status, that are the perpetrators of this unfortunate practice of claiming to say that we want to dissolve poverty or do X, Y, Z, have fantastic mission statements on their website, but do everything to protect their own power, to protect their own access. And that's a very ugly reality of navigating how to build social change. The way that I've come to navigate that is know who those players are, right? And you will learn very quickly when you put an idea out saying, let's try X, Y, Z. The organizations that clutch their pearls, those are the organizations will show up to the press conference for the press mention and use that press mention for a fundraising call, but won't actually be in a strategy meeting, won't do the actual hard work. And that's good to know. I use that as a data point in terms of understanding in the ecosystem of really pushing to change systems and institutions and processes so they are more equitable and more inclusionary. The organizations that feel that they have to protect the status quo are not ever going to do that willingly. And so that's kind of oftentimes you'll see this tension between oftentimes 100-year-old legacy institutions, right, that have fancy galas once a year, but actually in terms of on the ground work is somewhat limited. And then you have your grassroots organizations who are knocking on doors, but are holding it all together with bubble gum and rubber bands, right? But those grassroots organizations have community trust. They have the information from the ground, which is a level of information and a value point that oftentimes your more traditional C3-led organizations don't really value, because that doesn't add anything to their ability to protect the status quo. I say there's a role for even those types of organizations to protect the status quo. You just have to know when to use them and know what their limitations are. I'm a big believer in the fight for social change. Everyone has a role to play. You have your rabble rousers, and your rabble rousers are never going to have institutional access. That's why they're the rabble rousers, right? The folks who have institutional access are never going to sign on to a letter that, calls an elected official out, again, because their priority is protecting their access. With that said, if they're going to protect your access, the least they could do is set up a meeting so that we could have a conversation, right? And so kind of thinking through what are the roles that the different organizations in the ecosystem can play. Some, organizations have the power of media, right? If they say they're going to do something, it's very easy for media to show up at their press conference, which is really hard for a lot of community-based organizations to get, right? And so kind of thinking through what is the contribution and the liability for each of the organizations that are sharing this work with you, whether it is a true commitment to the work or if it's a superficial commitment to the work, right? It's important to know where each organization is. And I think that whenever I think it's part of the human condition for the more traditional organizations. I think it's part of the human condition that people want to protect their access. I don't agree with it. And I think that that's just a part of understanding why people are in this work. And again, they are tools that you can tap into when appropriate, but also know that they're never going to be your champion and use their access to really change anything. And so I think the more that we're able to kind of understand the ecosystem and learn which organizations and learn which people are really about it and ready to throw down for the cause, and which are more tepid and are really just there to get their logo on a website, which happens oftentimes, but are not really committed to the work. It's good to know that, and to kind of, as you're building out your game plan, to know this organization is going to show up at the press conference, and that's it. This other organization, they're going to be knocking on doors. They're going to be mobilizing, phone banks. They're going to be really, throwing in, in terms of political pressure. And the truth is that we need all of it, right? We need the folks with institutional access, and we need the folks who are not afraid to ruffle some feathers, because that's the only way that we are really going to be able to challenge the status quo strategically and in the long run.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I have found myself to get upset, and that is because I care so deeply, and there are people connected to me that care so deeply. And when
Right.
you really do care, it's a blessing and a curse, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you take the framework that you just provided, there's a level of objectivity that enables you to navigate and say, okay, wait a minute, what's
Yep.
my goal?
Yep.
What's my goal? Let me draft my roadmap. Let me take the sting out of it. Let me take the indignation and morality out of it, because, there's a part of me in my spirit that is like, no, I'm gonna cast this out, and I'm gonna tell this. And it's like, okay, all right, sister. All right, sit down. But to your point, it requires a multitude of strategies to achieve progress, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess there's room for everybody. And so I'm curious in terms of what's happening in New York right now, because I think New York is really important, and it's not just because I've lived here a long time. I think that specifically in the moment that we're in with the national conversation, and how maybe other regions of the country will look to the Northeast to see what they're doing, and then kind of, take in what they're doing and maybe see what is applicable in the geography that they're in, or kind of look at the messaging and what's occurring. I can't help but think it's important for people to kind of understand what's happening in New York right now with some of our elections, the primary, and some of the issues that are being raised, and how that is influencing the national conversation.
So New York is unique because even before I came to New York, I organized politically in Texas, Georgia, California, did some work in Alabama, DC, and now New York. And New York and California are viewed across the country as examples of potential national leaders because of the constituencies and the number of people that live here. With that said, I think one of the opportunities that New York has that I'm looking and paying attention to is we just came out of a mayoral election where we had the highest rate of young folk come out to vote. There's a lot to unpack there. And so as someone who is an elder millennial, and who's always heard, that the younger folks don't vote, it's always been a challenge to get folks under the age of 34 to come out consistently and vote. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Some of which touched on the topics that we've already discussed. People don't understand the power that's in their vote, or they vote, and oftentimes things don't change because change takes time, right? And so people will vote and they're mad because something didn't get done in 6 months. Well, people have been fighting for this for a long time. And that goes back to political education and understanding the processes of government. And government is very slow by design, because if things were able to change very quickly, then we would have a lot of instability. With that said, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for New York to show its leadership and show its strength, quite frankly, in how we choose to engage continuously the folks who have not traditionally been a part of the electoral base, starting with younger folks, and also through a racial lens. Just to name it, the Black electorate has been moving out of New York, right? And so there's this broader conversation in terms of what does Black political power look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now in New York, when a lot of folks have been moving out due to the cost of living, all the things, right? And so what has made New York for so long being it's been the center of so much diversity, particularly to the city, more so than the state. What does New York City look like in terms of political power? Is there going to be any type of change, any type of transition in terms of, folks who have been considered the machine, right? Is the machine breaking down? If it is that good or bad? And is it good or bad and for whom, right? Because for every winner, there's a loser. For every loser, there's a winner, right? And so there's layers to this when we're talking about generations, when we're talking through the racial lens, especially when we're talking through the class lens of what does New York City provide and what is the story that we are telling the rest of the nation in terms of this next generation of building political power.
Wow. I have to catch my breath because that was another Whopper. I'm getting fat.
With cheese.
I am my calorie excess at the moment because especially when you start talking about the machine, Lord have mercy.
Yes.
Yes.
Because we could talk about races, like specific electoral races congressionally. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm happy to lean into it because who wins reflects who has power and who's priority. And listen,
can't help myself. I can't help Are you in District 13?
I am in District 13.
I can't help it. And I want to preface, I did not know that before we started recording this, okay? It came up in the process of this conversation and us flowing.
It's a lot to unpack.
Right, especially for those who don't understand or may not understand like the significance of that. District 13 for a very long time, well, maybe 3 decades, had a black, more than 3 decades, maybe a black congressional member, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a bit of a redistricting, and then the electorate changed a little bit, and then the representation shifted to Dominican congressional member. And now there is a challenge, and I'm just curious, and I'm just curious on just what you generally think about that particular race that's happening right now, and some of the conversation about when do we know that it's time for a change of guard. And I'm not saying that it is a time. What I am asking is how do we know, and what are some of the signs? Because we've seen some other things, like, for example, up in the Bronx, I know that when AOC kind of rose to Congress, there had been an incumbent that was there for a long time and that comfortably had their machine working for them to bring out that, dedicated amount of voters to stay in. So I'm just curious, what are you looking for in this race and just your general thoughts?
So my brain is going into it's doing gold award-winning Olympic gymnastic flips because there's so many different directions to go into that. I want to say first and foremost to the audience, just for some level setting, the issue of Congressional 13 and some other high priority, high visible races go back to the fundamental question of thinking through what does political representation mean? And here in Harlem, for the last 40, 45 years, we've had Black representation because Harlem was the home of the Renaissance. It was Black power. It was Black electorate. It was Black folks building power in a country that historically didn't give a damn about them, but we were able to build our ecosystem within our businesses, within our political apparatus, where Black folks had power. And for a variety of reasons, as time marched on and people left, the demographic shifted, the representative who was supposed to represent the Black community ran against Adriana Espaillat, who was the current Congress member. And so it became this proxy war between Latino power versus Black power and Black power law, right? And there were some feelings about that, right? What does a Harlem look like when we no longer have a Black representative? With that said, Adriana Espaillat does represent the machine in the sense that, like, he was a state senator. He came from the party apparatus. And before I go into, I think, the top line assessment and thoughts about his opponent, a lot of people look at the machine as something that's big, bad, and terrible. And I won't disagree with that. But what I will say I think is really important is the history of where political machines began and really how in a time in history where Black folks were able to gain power only through becoming part of the machine. I think is an important historical note that is oftentimes lost. And so you have a lot of Black folk who are in the positions they are in because they were part of the machine, because there was nowhere else for them to go and build power, because it's called white supremacy and racism here in America. And so the political machine and the Democratic Party was a place where they were welcomed and able, again, to build power and to gain positions and titles that gave them influence to make these decisions. So I just want to say that just for some record setting in terms of the machine has evolved and, you know, it is what it is. But I do think it's important to acknowledge there was a point in time where the only way that you could build political power was by becoming a member of your political club, which was a part of the machine, right? Again, because of the history of America, Black folks were not allowed to build power in any other way. With that said, when we're talking about the challenger, and you'll see this similar, I think, what's the word, dynamic in other places. Harlem has changed. It's less than 50% Black now, right? I think we're at 47 or 48% Black. A lot of new folks, specifically white folk, have come in. A lot of younger folks have come in. So it's no longer the old Harlem Black homeowners. Folks have sold their brownstones for whatever reason.
And deed theft. Just
Yes.
throw that in there.
Fact.
Yeah, you
Yes.
know.
Yes, absolutely.
Just saying.
All the things. And so then you have, I don't want to mispronounce her name, Daria Zila?
I think so.
I don't want to mispronounce
that's how
her
it
name.
looks. That's how it looks when you read the paper
Yes.
and all that. That's how it looks.
Yes. I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation, but she's an Afro-Latina, right? And she represents Democratic Socialists of America. So she is not a Democrat. She is very much against the democratic machine. And the way that I look at it through this with her and other incumbents is there's levels to this, right? Of you can be an Afro-Latina and you can check off the diversity boxes. But when you look at the community that she's coming from and representing, which is DSA, it's majority white and middle class. Right. And so it's never a simple equation of she's Afro-Latina, therefore she will represent issues important to the Afro-Latino community, because that's not her base. Her base is Democratic Socialists of America, who, again, are a majority white and middle class. Now, to be clear, I want to be absolutely clear. That's not to say that she cannot represent the interests of working class, so on and so forth, because I'm sure she can, and I would hope so that she can. But this goes back to who pays the piper calls the song, right? And so if she were to win, it's DSA's priorities that are going to get tended to, right? And DSA's priorities are going to be very different based off of history than what is most important to working class, immigrant, Black and brown communities, because DSA looks at everything through a class prism and doesn't acknowledge the impact of race, gender, heteronormativity, all the things, right? And so it becomes this, again, going back to that broader question of what does political representation mean if we have someone who looks like us, but their priorities are based off of constituency that is not of us, right? And there's levels to unpack in that, right? And so I think right now in District 13 and in a few other races, it becomes this proxy war that has been really oversimplified in my mind, because it doesn't mean just because you look like my uncle, you have my best interest, because all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. And we have come on now, we have Black and brown elected officials who have been in office for years and ain't a damn thing changed. And so when we're talking about what does political representation mean, that's a really difficult, emotionally, psychologically, and electorally difficult question to unpack, because it forces us to think through, if a white man has my best interest at heart more so than someone who looks like my auntie, then I'm going to pull the lever for the white man who has my best interest at heart. And there's levels to that, right? In terms of what does it mean to be aligned with the Democratic Party versus the Democratic Socialist of America? I think there are a lot of key differences, but ultimately, when I'm walking down my street, I see my bodegas closing one by one, right? I'm just trying to make sure that I can pay Con Edison, pay my landlord, pay my bills, and maybe have a comfortable way of living. And so I think sometimes we get too stuck into it's necessarily about ideology or about who the actual representative is in terms of descriptive representation. where I think most people just want someone who can deliver, which goes back to the earlier part of our conversation, whether I am meeting with someone who is a white man or someone who looks like my auntie, I want to know, are you going to bring home the bacon to my district? Right? That's my number one priority. But there's also this generational lens that I've come to become familiar with in my work of I am a generation where I am privileged in a lot of ways to be able to consider that as an option, whereas older generation will vote for it's the reality that racial politics is the oldest organizing tool, right? Because there was a time when there wasn't any of us in office, right? And so there is that loyalty that we have to our own to support if someone who does not come from our ilk comes to potentially challenge you. Right. And so there's so many layers to this. I don't have a necessary specific answer to your question other than District 13, I think really represents this point of time of not just in New York, but possibly the country of what does it look like to know when to step down? When do dynasties die out? Should they? And if they do, how? And what does that mean for the next generation of people who are just trying to live their lives in the best ways that we can without it being diluted to a proxy war between the democratic machine, again, which has its issues, but also throughout history has, served its role in representation and getting more Black and brown folks into a political pipeline. Black and brown folks who have never left the pipeline and have been in that pipeline for 50, 60 years and don't know how to step down, which has led to this movement of reformers, of progressives, of leftists, of the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America who have seen a Democratic Party who has failed for a variety of reasons, but still failed time and time again. And so I don't necessarily think it's about ideology or if it's DSA versus Democrats or this is really about Daria Zila versus Espiat. I think this is really a coming to not just New York, but America of how can we each build a life where we can live a life that's comfortable, where we're not struggling to pay rent, where we don't have to work 3 jobs just to pay the bill, where our kids can play and go to school in neighborhoods that aren't next to brownfield, right? Just basic things that are still issues because the party apparatus, for a variety of reasons that we've discussed, have failed time and time again. And people are tired. And so all that to say, I'll land the plane by saying it goes back to us asking ourselves, what does political representation mean to me as an individual? And how does that definition translate to scale of asking, does my definition of political representation, is that reflected in whoever my representative is? And then the follow-up question is always fundamentally, how can I exercise my political power to make sure that I am in fact getting the political representation that me, my friends, my family, and my communities deserve?
Thank you. Thank you so much for holding space for nuance. Because I agree with you. I do think it's oversimplified. But then again, I think that that's why conversations like this are important so we can unpack and empower people to think for themselves as well. Because I think so much of that oversimplification is a part of a propaganda machine to get people to think in ways that are somewhat divisive and not issue-based, right? And so when you talk about some of these identity politics, like regardless of whether my representative actually physically looks like me or, something about their essence reminds me of my own, let's say they are from, another culture or group or what have you, but hey, they're doing their job really well. They are inclusive. I feel like I have a seat at the table and they're delivering, which one is more important? And I think my observation, whether it's on the ground floor or in various organizing spaces, I think DSA is motivating maybe some people who have been comfortable to resharpen their tools and not take specific communities for granted.
Absolutely.
And then there's another thing that you said that is kind of near and dear to me because I'm an openly Caribbean person. Both of my parents are Jamaican, and I have done work around organizing the Caribbean diaspora. And when we talk about Caribbean diaspora, that's a very culturally vast group with different languages, right? And so this whole way about the way this country splits, oh, well, Latino power versus Black power, for those of us who are Caribbean,
Yep.
it gets a little, it gets a little dicey
Yep.
because,
Yep.
I have,
Yep.
first of all, I have relatives that are half Cuban or,
Yep.
look, and then it depends on where I am. I live in the Bronx. They don't assume I'm Jamaican when they see me. They might think that I'm from,
Yep.
a Latin country or something, depending on where I am and what I'm doing.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
I say all that to say, if we, I think we have to get past some of these old school divisive politics because it's not helping us. It's not. I really, and I get it because I'm also guilty again of that trope about Jamaicans having 5 jobs. I'm guilty of that, right? And so living that life where you're kind of going from one gig to the next, you don't necessarily have the capacity to absorb all the information that would help you make the most informed choice about who you're voting for. Or you're like, I'm sure there are plenty of things that have happened in my borough and in New York City Hall that completely got past my desk and I didn't see it. And maybe if I knew a little bit more about it, I would be on my own podcast raising hell. So I say all that to say, when we bringing it back to voter education, how do we keep people informed in a way that empowers them to think for themselves and make and support those who they feel are effective and aligned with their interests?
I love that question because civic political participation, there's so much to do in so little time. One of the things that I advise folks is like, listen, voting aside, you should do it because it's very important because that's your segue into the political universe. So you become, part of the political calculations when decisions are made. With that said, what's an issue that you're passionate about? You can just pick one, right? Maybe it's stopping or changing the truck routes of the sanitation trucks that go up and down, which is why kids in the Bronx have the highest rate of asthma, right? Because all the sanitation truck routes are up in the Bronx. Is it educational equity? Is it criminal justice reform? Like, what's your issue? Something that impacts your life in a deeply personal way, whatever that may be. And an organization, you could be part of a coalition. They have listers that send out, informations and follow-ups. They'll have meetings that if you choose to do so and if you have capacity, you can go and attend these meetings. But find out one thing that speaks to you, that sets your soul on fire, right? Whatever that issue may be, and find a way to engage with it, right? Whether it's the local level, the state level, maybe it's federal. I will say your city and your state are have the most opportunity for you to make effective change more quickly. The federal process is just a lot longer, but absolutely doable. But if you're able to find that issue that, again, really speaks to you, you're going to be able to want to be engaged and updated on the information that is about that issue that impacts you. And again, if you have capacity, go to meetings, you'll meet new people. And if you have even more capacity, maybe you'll be able to go to a few meetings with elected officials or go up to Albany if the issue is a state level. I think the most important type of advocacy is the advocacy that you're going to do, right? And it's not so much about, committing 30 hours a week to do advocacy. It's the simple everyday things that you can do that, again, continue to educate you, continue to engage you. If you go to a meeting, bring a friend, right? And so what I love about advocacy is that it belongs to everyone, right? It's not for professionals who have fancy titles on their business cards. Advocacy belongs to all of us because government belongs to us, right? And advocacy is our channel through which we can begin to form and build and keep a government that reflects our needs for the people as opposed to folks who, have a lot of money to spend for access. We may not have a lot of money to spend for access, but we have targeted areas of opportunity where we can interject and be part of that process. And so I'll end by saying again, advocacy is a really broad category and it encapsulates a lot of different ways to do things that change policies or change systems or change institutions. But again, the most important type of advocacy, again, is the type of advocacy that you can do. And the most consistent way of finding that way of doing something over time is to find that issue that really just speaks to you. And again, join a coalition, join an organization. Again, ebbs and flows, myself included. I belong to quite a few organizations. Sometimes I could make the meetings, sometimes I can't. But I'm always staying updated on, they want me to call so-and-so on such a date. I wasn't able to go to the meeting, but now I know at 2:00 on a Tuesday, I'm supposed to call XYZ. And so there are ways that you can still stay updated and also educate yourself on the issue, right? Issues are constantly changing over time and sometimes they don't. But again, just find ways that you can connect yourself in the long term and do the little things that you can do, because even those little things definitely can make an impact in the long term. One of the things that I don't know if it's called a parable or a story, what have you, but I always think about people feel they have to do all these things in order to make a change. And I say, think about the water and the stone. A tiny stream of water, gentle trickling down, can literally change the shape of a rock. It's not forcing it, but it's just the steady drip of water over time and consistency is able to change something literally as hard as a rock. We can do the same when we lean into the issues that ignite us, and we continue to show up when we can and how we can, which is the bedrock of advocacy.
That is an incredible parable. And I was visualizing just images that you have seen of whether it's the Grand Canyon or just other structures in stone that have been created through water running through them. As we come to a close, I have some rapid fire questions for you. And one thing I think that is important because of where you have sit in various spaces. What, in terms of okay, let me back up. Set the stage.
Set the stage.
I am of the belief that if we could get Black and Latino voters on the same exact page, we would see transformation in the society at every level. What do you think will help Black and Latino voters get on the same page for there to be more unity and drive transformation?
Oh, I love that question. I'm going to answer that question with a story from my time as executive director of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. As part of that caucus was literally all the Black, Latino, and Asian council members serving New York City at the time. And I remember thinking how exciting it would be to be able to, again, help drive and help shape coordinate the legislative and budget priorities of the caucus. And I had this realization where we have the titles Black, Latino, and Asian, but there is a lot that goes under the title Black and Latino and Asian. So I think there's a built-in assumption that Black, Latino, and Asians would share the same goals. And even if we had the same goals, we would all have the same idea of how to achieve that goal. And in my caucus at the time, I had, I'll use their names because I've shared this story before. I had a Fernando Cabrera and I had an Antonio Reynoso, who are both Dominican council members at the time. And I remember thinking how peculiar and ironic it is that I have two Dominican council members who could not possibly be on further ends of the spectrum, but yet here they are together, both Dominican men, and both council members representing different boroughs, of course. But that's the challenge, right? There are broader labels that the assumption is made that these labels will automatically create a shared sense of purpose. But in practice, those labels in a lot of ways end up being superficial for all the reasons, right? And so one of the things that I have learned in my own journey is we have to fight the system and not each other. But we fight each other because it's so much easier, right? And so that's why when we under, the caucus label or just like general labels under Black, you have Black folks like from Atlanta, where I'm from. Then you have Caribbean folks, and then we have our African, right? Three different histories, three different experiences of American history in particular, three different lenses of how to navigate in America through three different immigration experiences, perceptions of white society. Same thing with the Latino community. I learned very quickly moving to New York, it's Dominican and Puerto Ricans. And then when Dominicans outnumber the Puerto Ricans, it was a really big deal. And so there are levels of we are given bucket that we are dropped into. And the hope is that those buckets would make us work together. But again, in reality, we nitpick and we fight amongst each other as opposed to fighting the very systems and institutions that forced us into the bucket together. With that said, as long as we continue the approach of fighting each other, we're never going to win. Right. And it's as simple as that. We have to build an understanding. This goes through political education. You have to build the will, which also goes back to political empowerment and finding those fighters, right? The folks who are not going to sell out because they want an invitation to the holiday party at Gracie Mansion, but they're willing to risk that to do what's right by the people, right? And that goes back to mentorship and support, because that's what leads us to, if we as Black and brown folks and all the subtitles that fall underneath them were to have a laser focus on dismantling the system, which would then dismantle the institution, then there would be no stopping us, right? But it's by design that we are forced to fight one another as opposed to focusing on what is the goal that we want for our people. How do we work together collaboratively? We don't have to agree on everything because we're not, right? But what is the goal that we want to get to together? And then how can we pool our community's resources, our talents, our wealth of knowledge of, when we pool together, we can absolutely shake it up. But again, by design, it's so much easier to point the finger at each other to say, you are the reason that I don't have access to A, B, and C. You are the reason why my community is X, Y, and Z. But I share your vision. I share your belief that if we were to come together, we would be unstoppable. It is unfortunately the design of the system and society that it just makes it easier to fight each other as opposed to fighting the actual system and the people who created the system and sustain it. And next additional nuance, oftentimes we replicate those systems of oppression ourselves. But that's another podcast we're not ready for.
We've had 2 massive Whoppers. Now that was just an extra large smoothie. So I'm chasing the Whoppers with sugar and dairy.
Listen.
Wow. Yeah. I have to sit with that one. I recognize you only come to that realization through having sober experiences and being in situations where you thought you could effectuate change, and then you run into all these obstacles, some of which are a lot of them are actually produced by other people, right? And so as we close, I would love to hear what gives you hope and how listeners can support the work that you're doing and some of the organizations that you think that we should know about and also support.
I love that. What gives me hope? What gives me hope today is the same thing that has given me hope the first time I knock on a door of a complete stranger. It's people. It's everyday people who, even though they are tired or even though they have 1,000 things to do on the to-do list before the end of the day, they still take the time to do one thing, no matter how small. Again, because it does contribute to that broader sea wave of change, of making a difference. There are so many people whose names we will never know, whose faces you will never see on television, You won't see their names printed in, the newspaper, but they show up and they do this work every day, right? Sometimes full time as a chosen profession, oftentimes just as something that they do because they care that much about the community. And sometimes again, it's more intermittent. It comes in spurts here and there when they can, and all of that is just as important. As the next. And so everyday people give me hope, right? I love what I do. It's incredibly rewarding. It is also incredibly challenging, and at worst can be incredibly draining and demoralizing. But what always brings me back from the brink is a reminder that I am not doing this work alone. I've always and will always do this work in community with other people who show up when they can because we love our communities that much to again to show up when and how we can. So that again is what has always given me hope throughout my entire journey in this work that I do. I think to the last question of how folks can support or stay connected to my work, you can, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I do social commentary and analysis. I do have a website with information on civic engagement trainings and services for issue campaign at NaIlahAmaru.com, NaIlahAmaru.com. And if you are a nonprofit or part of a nonprofit or community-based organization, you don't need to have the CFU status. My bread and butter, what feeds my soul, is advocacy trainings and thinking through coalition strategies. So feel free to reach out directly. And there are a lot of organizations that I've been a part of that do this work year round. I'm a founding member of Higher Heights, which invests in the leadership of Black women, specifically running for office. I'm a national trainer with Vote Run Lead, which also the goal for that organization is to diversify political representation and prepare women who are interested in running for office. There are so many amazing organizations that I've been a part of and continue to be a part of that really center racial equity and gender justice, the needs of working class folks in New York to build political power. And I encourage the listeners to again think about what is that issue that sets your soul on fire? What is that issue that really speaks to you? That even on your hardest days, if someone mentions this issue or something about it, it sparks you. And that's very telling because that's a beginning point for you to think through what are the organizations or coalitions that you can be a part of so that you can also contribute your time and your talent and your treasure using this issue as a channel in your own journey of building governing power.
Thank you for being here today. All of the work that you do. I'm excited about the moment that we're in. I know there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, but I do believe that the people who are part of what's occurring right now are going to be setting the trajectory for what will be the outcome of the next century. I think that that's the moment we're in. We're in a very defining moment.
Absolutely. Fundamentally, I agree with you. We are at a turning point in where we, as a people, right, have this opportunity to either protect democracy and its systems as is and still continue to work on making them more inclusionary. And also at the same time, reimagine what we haven't been able to realize, right, is this democracy experiment is just that. It's an experiment. It was predicated on this vision of what it could be. And all of us has a role in making a contribution to making sure that we are in fact a part of American government because government belongs to us. And again, fundamentally, I believe what drives me in this work is that we have the power of the people, and it is through the power of the people that we will able to effectuate change when we continue to show up, challenge the status quo, and lean into the strengths of ourselves individually and build collectively the strength of our communities and our neighborhood, again, to reimagine what democracy and what American government and what society can really look like